how you set it up, who's it going to be a part of. So NCSC is part of GCHQ. That is not favoured by some countries. Some countries find that link to intelligence agencies too difficult. For us, it's a benefit in that we can share information from the secret classified side into the less classified side. But to be able to have confidence in that, you need to have strong rule of law, you need to have strong protections around how intelligence can be used and all of those kind of things. So that is a model that doesn't necessarily sit comfortable for everybody. We also chose to make the NCSC not a regulator. Again, that's an issue that comes up. Some countries are keen for it to be a regulator. I think with all of those issues, you need to look at the circumstance within the country and assess the different factors and how the different parts of government fit together. The way we have built the NCSC works in the UK context because we have these certain other elements going on, and it might not work exactly like that in other countries. But I think that's the conversation that we need to have when we kind of have these exchanges about why does it work that way and why is it better that it might be like that in a different country.
Very good. Now, hopefully, do we have Kerry Ann available? Yes. Wow, what a relief. Good. This brings me back to the days of online meetings, and I was just praising in person, but welcome to you. We're delighted to, you can hear us, totally delighted. So a question to you, just what do you see as cyber capacity building? Like, what is it? You know, we talk a lot about education and awareness. What sort of provisions do you see as cyber capacity building, and is that going to change in the future?
Thanks for the question, and thanks for having the OAS be part of this. Cyber capacity building, I think over the years have gotten so many different definitions. Within the OAS, how we started to address it, and I'm trying to coin this term, so if it comes out here, you heard it from me first, we're actually starting to do intelligent capacity building. One of the things we recognize is that there is a broad brush of, yes, you need education, you need training, you need awareness raising for the general public, but we're recognizing more and more that it has to be tailored, not just to the maturity based on the maturity models we have, but actually working on each country's nuances. So for example, what might be culturally acceptable in one country would be different from another country. We're actually looking as well on languages and cultural norms that might be different. For example, you may have an indigenous community that you're doing awareness raising to, and what is traditional for us in like traditional English speaking or Latin speaking, Spanish speaking countries, it would be different for the persons in indigenous communities. So looking at how can we make what we're offering intelligent to their needs. So in essence, how we're seeing capacity building is one, doing an assessment of what the skill sets are that exist, looking at the risk factors to that community to see what skill sets may be needed based on the risk, and then building programs around that to meet the risk or to be able to anticipate or react to the risk, recognizing that you can't always mitigate the risk. We're also looking at capacity building from the perspective of capabilities, looking at the fact that the capabilities needed might be unique to either the services that are being offered, where the country might be digitally in terms of connected. Not every country is connected digitally. When you look at a small island state that is still very paper-based, as opposed to a country like Uruguay that's completely going digital, the needs and the capabilities might be different. They may be either basic, they could be the same, but it could be basic, mid, intermediate, or very skilled, high skilled. So we're looking at capacity building as being more tailored in the future, recognizing that with the global effort that has been made over the past 10 years, I think almost all countries are aware that cybersecurity is important. So what I'm seeing over the next 10 years from now is that we're going to get more tailored. Another difference I think I'm seeing in the future for capacity building is more coordination among implementers. For example, in the Latin American space, we have an EU project, LAC4. We have the UK giving funding through the OAS to support. We have Canada, we have the US, we have Spain, we have different larger countries and entities, the World Bank, IDB. So I'm seeing that because there's now a lot more actors, the future will involve a lot more cooperation and transparency among the actors, because We would need to start saying, okay, we're serving the same audience. We need to ensure that we're not duplicating the efforts. We need to make sure that we are building the capabilities, not just doing the same thing over and over. So not just 1 + 1, 1 + 1, 1 + 1, and everybody's given that. We can actually get 2 to 2 + 1 and get to 3. So I think that's the short answer right now.
Thank you. Yeah, a lot of points there about, donors providing the same provision and needing to talk to each other. I think that's something we definitely need to untangle. A question for you on national cybersecurity centres. I touched upon it with Kat, so the UK stood up its own national cybersecurity centre. Obviously, you in your previous answer said, there is no one context. We're talking about different countries here. We're talking about different capabilities. Could you just talk us through, the evolution of potentially having, national cybersecurity centres in certain countries? You could bring out a certain example, and what are the challenges there?
In our region specifically, if I speak to that, what we have been emphasizing, to be honest, is more national coordination, ensuring that there is an entity, a person, a desk that can speak to the coordination. The role of a national cybersecurity center from our perspective is that entity that not just house all the potential capabilities of our country, but has the mandate specifically to be able to coordinate on cybersecurity issues. So how we're seeing the evolution is some countries may not have the funding to be able to set up an entire center, or the public administrative processes to set that up would take years for them to, one, either put a legislation in place, then find the funding and the structure, and then with some of the gaps we have in skills right now, being able to fully house what we perceive as a center. The two approaches we have been taking to get our countries to that point of a coordinator or a central point of being able to have cybersecurity strategically managed is, one, encouraging a national cybersecurity strategy, which we think is the baseline before you even get to a center. If countries choose to not have a strategy, it's really ensuring that they think through who is in charge. Who is in charge of not being the sole decision-maker in cybersecurity, but who can coordinate it. The third thing that we try to do is look at them having an incident response team at the national level, ensuring that there's capability to respond to an incident while recognizing that there needs to be someone given the policy directive at a national level for the country. Cybersecurity centers globally, we've observed, have taken different forms and shape. Some of them are the sole entity for incident response handling, and they don't dictate policy. And you have some of them globally that they dictate policy, standards, and they also do incident response capabilities. So I think when you ask the question of what is our view on cybersecurity centers, I think it's still going to be varied, not trying to be nondescript or non-specific, but it's recognizing that it may not be the complete answer. And I think it's the function and purpose behind it is what we've been trying to focus on, recognizing the means that some other countries have. If I give specific examples, we're seeing some of our countries, for example, Chile has been moving towards that. And we think based on their progression over the years with cybersecurity, it will come together as something I think that will be able to coordinate both at the strategic level, policy level, and be able to still coordinate with their incident response teams. We have Dominican Republic that has it in various houses, but still all intelligence, defense, and cybersecurity, their incident response team coordinate holistically to show that they do have a common view as to how cybersecurity is addressed at the national level. And then you have smaller countries like Antigua and Barbuda that has a director of cybersecurity. So while they don't have a center, they have a director, and the director is who coordinates the certs and responses to the UN, but everything goes through that shop. Guyana, similarly, it's run through a different entity, but at the end of the day, cybersecurity is managed or discussed at that level, or they're involved in any discussion related to that. So I think that's it.
Very good, thank you. And I mean, it does, for me, that tells me about how we organize ourselves bureaucratically across government's matters, right? So sometimes these, these threats, defense think they own them. Sometimes it's intelligence thinks they own them. Every country has a different context, and that will inform the pace of change of how we can roll these things out. Onto the threat, a question, and if I may come to you, Kat, now. So in the UK, we've quite a big, it struck me as well, the UN negotiations a couple months ago, but in the UK too. You know, the ransomware threat is something we talk about a lot. You know, these groups, they've been going for years. They seem to have found the perfect business model. How much is the ransomware threat now being discussed at the international level, and what steps are being taken to deal with it?
Thanks. Yeah, it's an issue that has increasingly gained traction internationally. So in the UK, ransomware is considered a national security threat. It has a huge impact within the UK and globally, of course, and it continues to grow and evolve into different kinds of threats as well. And it's very challenging to kind of get your hands around it. I think in terms of how we work internationally, we have to work internationally on ransomware because it is a transnational problem, and it's one that you can't solve within your own kind of boundaries with it. You might have some success, but on specific elements, but you're not going to solve the problem. So in terms of how we're kind of looking at that, the UK works very much with the Counter Ransomware Initiative, the CRI, which has, I think, 37 members at the moment. Could have been some more since I last looked. I'm not going to swear to it. That has really kind of looked to try and move forward with some concrete action on this issue in the last year, 2 years. So we lead on the illicit finance working group with Singapore in that forum, which we think is illicit finance being a particular area of interest for the UK, but also an area that we've had some success in previously that we wanted to share. And it's really about what everyone can bring to the table to increase everybody's capabilities within that group. So the UK now brings to that grouping some threat intelligence reports that go out every quarter, which list the top 10 ransomware threats to the UK and why they are the top 10, how we've assessed them. I think one of the key issues, and perhaps we might touch on it with Carrie-Anne, is data and availability of data about this threat in different regions. So in the UK, the NCSC is able to give us quite a clear steer on where the different threats are coming from, but that data doesn't necessarily exist across all countries or regions. A lot of these issues are not actually reported, so you don't necessarily have a full set of data. So actually kind of getting your hands around what's going on can be quite challenging. So sharing our assessment of the top 10 for the UK, it will be different for different countries and it'll be different in the Latin American region, but hopefully can start to show people where we are at, what kind of level of assessment we've managed to get to, and where we might be able to work together on different groupings where people do know that they're subject to attacks from certain quarters.
Very good, thank you. And Carrie-Anne, back at you. I've just called out ransomware as a major threat. Am I right? Or what other threats are you seeing if we miss something?
Thinking about the method in which ransomware happens is a couple of steps before the actual ransomware attack. So a lot of it starts with phishing campaigns, malicious attachments, emails. So thinking through how the hacker actually gets into those systems and the knowledge that the persons need to have before that. I think what Kat spoke about in terms of just persons being basic awareness of what are the steps before the actual ransomware is critical. Sometimes we focus on the process that happened after. So it's like, you know that you could get a cold and you need to do all the things after. And we're so focused on the fact that you're sneezing and everything else is happening. But what could have happened before then? So for us, there is, if you think about the almost 50 million Latin Americans and Caribbean persons got online after COVID. So pretty much the landscape in which, or the threat landscape in which persons could actually get attacked increased. And the persons who are just going all the way back to what are the basic things. Some persons are still at home, still don't have the security measures on their systems at home. They're still clicking. So the basic awareness of the events that takes place before a ransomware is still pretty much, to me, a live threat. The human factor right there behind it is still one of the largest threats we have in our region, I believe. The ransomware is a threat. We actually just launched and published a paper with AWS on that and strategies that organizations and countries can take to just better equip themselves against it. We recognize as well that once the incident happens, the other greatest threat is the lack of capability to actually respond to the incident. So that is also a threat. It may not be something that is big in the news, but once a ransomware happens, to me, the threat is the absence of the capability. And how can we ensure that when it happens, because it's inevitable, that the capabilities are there to address those the ransomware incident. Another big threat that we see is actually looking at attacks on some of the protocols that are happening. A lot of the countries are being attacked at the very basic level of their infrastructure and their IP addresses, and there's still a lot of DNS abuse in the region. So there are many other threats as well. And as I said, it's the events that takes place before, like the ransomware, which makes the news, that we need to look at. One thing I could probably highlight, I can share the paper that we published. We actually look at Wakamaya and Conti and look at the difference that some of these incidents that we've titled as ransomware were probably not actually ransomware because they were just data theft that took place. And I think being able to educate the public as well, as Kat says, making sure that people are aware of it. One of our biggest assets right now in OAS is our CSERTs Americas network, which we now have almost 41 national certs as a part of that. And what Kat spoke about being able to disseminate the information quickly, we've been looking at means in which to send threat data through that network as fast as we can to our member states. And when Conti happened, we saw, and Wakamaya, we were able to use that network to share the data, the threats, and solutions instantly. And I think the absence of that in other regions is also a global threat. Because you need to be able to share data quickly when incidents like this happen. So I'll stop there.
Very good, thank you. Last question for you, Carrie-Anne. If there was one practical way that you think the UK and Latin America could work together on cyber, and you had the keys and the control and the money to make it happen, what would you choose?
Well, the good news I could probably tell everyone is that the UK and the OAS is working together right now. We've been working together for the past 3 years. And what has been really amazing about the relationship between the UK and the OAS is that we're able to build our projects together. The UK did a very good strategic move when they actually placed region-specific persons within Latin America and the Caribbean. So like, for example, we have a Caribbean point of contact. We have someone for Central America, and we have someone for South America. And with that, we're able to coordinate efforts in terms of what the UK is doing at the bilateral level with our member states, as well as what the OAS is doing at a regional level, and find very concrete, specific projects. So if I were to have a key, I think one of the things I would use it to do is to probably unlock more multi-year approach to this corporation. Right now, we're not able to do it multi-year, and sometimes you can't see the impact of the change that you're trying to make without it being multi-year. But with the UK, we have been able to do 2 very strategic things, which is one, build out master classes in cyber diplomacy, which we're continuing to do with them. And the second thing is to improve specific countries' incident response capabilities. And that has been 2 of the very significant results of our relationship with the UK in the recent years.
Very good. I knew you'd choose something. See, there's always something at the top of someone's wish list. Very good. And same question to you, Kat. You know, if you could think about looking to the future, you know, one practical area that you think the UK and Latin America and countries could cooperate on cyber, what would they be, or what would it be?
It's hard to choose. I mean, I agree with Carrie-Anne about multi-year programming. That would make things a lot better. I think it would have to be probably, I think at the moment we're seeing a lot of kind of thinking around incident response. So something around the incident response and resilience link. Resilience is really the key to everything. Whatever happens with the threat in the future, resilience is still going to be the key. So all of the work to kind of grow capacity around strategies and just generally getting people thinking about how to structure themselves to deal with ongoing threat in this space generally. And incident response, I think, we've seen increasing demand globally, and not just in the region, inspired by the impact of different attacks for that kind of emergency incident response. So how do we move countries from you've got a country who maybe doesn't have a lot of spare cash to invest, which is quite a lot of us at the moment, to kind of put into this as a resource. And so they're kind of patching things and hoping it will all work. They need to be online to be able to maximize the benefits from kind of digital economy and so on, but they're not actually really investing in their security. And at some point, we know it's going to come back to bite them, and that might be a small impact or it might be a major impact. And at that point, who do you turn to? Who do you ask to help? And how do you show them that you've actually done some of that preparatory work? So in terms of, a certain country kind of struggling to invest, someone will come and help you out on one instance, but then it might be that next time around, it's not an endless source of money. And if you haven't been able to invest, then they're not going to be able to come and help you again. So how do we make it simple for people to identify the key risks that they need to be working on? And how do we kind of get the right balance between that, what is emergency response to support a country when they've had a major incident and, everybody wants to help, but not ending up with some kind of, ambulance service that just goes around and comes in and like sorts you out when you've had an incident, because that's not going to be sustainable. So how do we manage this kind of emergency incident response question at the national level? Obviously, there'll always be, incidents which require different levels of support, where when it's a really serious, as in Costa Rica, really serious national level incident, there's only going to be a finite capacity that people can come in and kind of help, and we're not going to be able to do it forever and ever. So how do we make it sustainable? I think is turn that into something, Kerry. Kind of turn that
and I was listening to you, and if I could just jump back in, because I think one of the key things with the UK's approach, which we've appreciated, is that specificity. It's the ability to recognize that it's not about another government just helping another government. It's making sure that when the UK walks away, the government is in a position with a better tool. What Kat spoke about that kind of specific skill set or maturity that the programming that we do helps the country to go from A to B is critical. And what we look forward to with the UK is being able to build on what already exists. For example, the UK had supported Jamaica in building their first national cert. And since then, we have done capability building with the country since then. And I think that kind of approach of not just repeating what was done initially, but building year on year is critical. So when I mentioned the multi-year, it's the whole fact that sometimes when you start an initiative, you can't really see the benefit of it until after. And as Kate really said, incident capability building is the key thing. When an incident like a ransomware happens, it's how do they, one, recover, and how do they actually even identify that it's happening to them without just someone from outside coming in? To just build on that, Kate, I think one of the things that we may, if we go back to futuristic, is looking at how, as a region, we can respond when incidents happen like this. And it's a discussion that we'll be having internally to see what does a regional response look like when there's a national incident like Costa Rica. I think that's another level of discussion the globe has to also consider.
Thank you very much. Excellent. So I think, something I take from that is we need to make programming sustainable. There's no point just providing a capability that then, isn't used or taken advantage of in the longer term. Great. So after a technical glitch, I'm only 10 minutes over, so sorry. Thank you. Thanks to Kat and Carrie Ann for this expertise. I mean, deep expertise here in the field, lots of, lived experience at this stuff, and that helps everyone get better. So thank you both for your time. And from me, obrigado a vocês.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I let everyone fill a glass of water. I first have to apologize. I don't speak Spanish. I don't speak Portuguese. Sorry for that. I studied German literature, so I could say something in German, but it wouldn't be really helpful. Very nice to see so many people in the room, and I saw there's a nice number of online participants. My name is Caroline Weiser-Harris. I work at the Global Cybersecurity Capacity Center at the University of Oxford. We are partnering with the Organization of American States for the regional cybersecurity maturity assessments, and it was good to see Carrie Ann. But for that reason, also I kind of so what is happening in the region over the last 8 years. So I'm very happy to chair this panel. I'm very happy to see so many experts here on this wonderful panel. I think it was, thank you very much for the keynote before. I think we heard a lot about what actually are the common threats, the common challenges that those countries face, like the Latin American region, but also like the UK and other countries, with a lot of common challenges. But we also heard how important the context is, and how important is it to really do tailored capacity building, demand-driven capacity building. And this panel, we wanted a little bit see and elaborate, discuss where the common challenges, where maybe things have to be more, where are the divergences. And we want to take a really bit broader view, and I'm very happy to that all of us, the panelists, can contribute to this. I didn't learn all the biographies by heart, so I'm going to read it out. But we're going to take a more broader view, and then we do want to discuss how that looks on the ground. So next to me is Carlos Solar, Dr. Carlos Solar. Is a senior research fellow here at RUSI, where he leads the Latin American Security Program. He's also of Cybersecurity Governance in Latin America, States, Threats and Alliances, published this year by State University of New York Press. So Carlos, could you please tell a little bit okay, we are looking at the region, but the region, of course, in a very big global context, and there's a lot of very interesting things happening. Can you elaborate a little bit, what is the big picture, the big context you have to look at cyber capacity building in the region?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Caroline, for the question. I think it's my turn to basically destroy cybersecurity, multilateralism, and be mean and in terms of what the world is, and provide a realistic perspective, just to challenge my colleagues here who are the implementers of everything Kate and Carrie Ann have said. So obviously that we live in a very complex world, in a world dominated by security threats and what these countries believe are threats or not, whether in the cyberspace or in the the other four theaters of war and security, as we learn them in war colleges and IR relations and so on. So I think there's a huge challenge for governments and for those organizations that work closely with governments to bring those two at hand, to create a balance between everything that multilateralism and cooperation mean, and also about the nuances of how countries might work together or not. So I think I picked up three ideas from the previous panel. One on what I call the fragmentation of governance, and whether Latin America is on the second or the third wave of cybersecurity capacity building, depending on where you looked at it. I'm very familiar with the work of OAS because and the book that you just mentioned, I downloaded the first survey that OAS did back with the countries. And then you could see that the more connected that these countries in Latin America are, so internet penetration, you could see that there is clearly a correlation with more cybersecurity capacity in terms of legislation, policy, and so on. So that's an amazing indicator. But you'll see that the countries that are very much in the top, so countries highly connected with countries with a higher cybersecurity capacity, are just the few. So the most of Latin America is back in the tail of this, positive line. So what do we do with those countries, right? And where do those countries sit strategically right next to each other so that we can really have some security governance around on the international scenario. I think OAS and the countries that we just heard are doing fantastic work, but obviously the challenge here is how we start to create networks of governance which implement different countries, right? So different countries with historically have seen each other with different perspectives of how they want to perceive international security. So you typically have two sides of the coin. If you go south to north, you have Chile and Argentina with their own things. You have Chile and Peru with their own criticism to each other. Then you go up north, and then you have Colombia against Venezuela, and the other way around, and then you go all the way up until, and then you stop at Mexico. So when we hear from OAS and countries like FCDO, in which you find now going into Kerry-Ann's new term, the intelligence capacity building. Yeah, so you're trying to create something that's very tailored, but with a perception in which the more tailored that you get, the less horizontal of your network it will be. So you're creating microcosms of policy in a larger cybersecurity governance sphere. I'm going to leave China and what it means to my colleague Brian, but then I'm just going to go quick into the role of the US. So we didn't hear the role of the US on the previous panel, right? So we tend to think that Latin American cybersecurity stops at the northern border of Mexico, when it's not like that. I mean, obviously we're sitting in the UK, but I think it's very important that the UK and special partnership that it has with the US, it also translates into more cybersecurity capacity building in the region, especially because we have very strong partners of the US, both in the diplomatic track and the military track, which is something that I guess we can pick up later.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So the whole Jack Gordon, Institute for Public Policy, and an adjunct professor at the Department of Politics, International Relations at Florida International University. Yeah, you would like to pick up this the question around the US perspective, but also a bigger global.
Since Carlos started off so optimistic, I'm going to do the same and continue that. So I do want to talk about the broader geopolitical context, but let me start with the region first and foremost, because, you know, at the heart of capacity building or capacity enhancements or capacity strengthening, whichever term you decide to use, is diplomacy, multilateralism, bilateral forms of diplomacy. But diplomacy is at the heart. And so when you think about the region in general, I still think that there is a tremendous amount of distrust among nations in the region that I think impede a real deepening of multilateralism and collaboration in the area of cyber. So as you think about, you know, the implementation of cyber capacity building, and you bring countries together, whether it's CSIRTs or building networks or communities of expertise, I think there is still a floor that you're going to hit in which distrust among countries in the region is going to impede the ability to do real deep, meaningful information sharing, incident response, and other things that I think are really vital to you know, sort of the intent of capacity building and building these communities of expertise in the region. So I did want to start there because I think that's an important part that tends to get lost. I've had the opportunity to work, you know, in Latin America, bringing security institutions together for the last 20 years, and it's been incredibly painful. You get to the table, and I think a lot of, you know, communities are willing to come to the table, have dialogue, but as you start to go a bit deeper in building the kind of institutional connective tissue that really produces something tangible, you start to find yourself more challenged at getting into some of the more, you know, delicate areas. And so I think one is, you know, we think about the region, you know, in the terms of a fairly, you know, consistent and harmonized region, but it certainly has its areas of distrust I think are important. So that's one. I think in the broader geopolitical context, we have to at least accept that capacity building is occurring in a context of, you know, kind of a return to great power competition, right? And so you have the US, you have UK, you have, you know, sort of broader, you know, Western nations that have one view of cyber and the internet governance, et cetera, sort of competing in a space against China, Russia, and perhaps others. And that competition is playing out in spaces like Latin America, in which capacity building is being, you know, part of the engagement strategies of both, you know, sort of sides of this particular dimension. So I think that's really important, especially as you start to get into things like information sharing, adopting of technology. Part of the US's pursuit is really about building programming that deepens understanding and adherence to the application of international law, and the pursuit of, frameworks and sort of ethical behavior in cyberspace. And that contrasts, I think, with some of its rivals in the international system. And so that competition tends to play out in places like Latin America. Again, since this is a not for attribution, I had a conversation recently with US government in which they raised the issue that some of the capacity building going on in Latin America was occurring vis-a-vis universities that had greater connective tissue with China than perhaps other institutions with greater connective tissue with, for the example, the United States, and how that undermines sort of the competitive nature of the US trying to get in front of building capacity that's more consistent with the values and norms that it's trying to promote in the region and in the international system in general. And so again, I think as we think of capacity building, we nest it squarely in the context of diplomacy and pursuits of bilateral and multilateral forms of diplomacy. The great power competition, or the strategic competition era, is I think really important to consider as we think about how to get the right kind of return on investment and how we align resources. And we can talk later on about the challenges just within the US government to deploy effective capacity building efforts. But I'll stop there as part of the opening salvo. I tried to continue the optimism of so distrust and strategic competition being important environments in which international capacity building is unfolding.
Thank you very much. So this is basically the backdrop. We are discussing the issue. I think now we have three excellent panelists who elaborate a bit more and tell us a bit more about, okay, what are the approaches to capacity building from a regional perspective, also from a national perspective. So I first would like to ask Isabel Ibarra Serrano de Haro. She's a diplomat at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation of the Kingdom of Spain, where she holds the role as a technical advisor for cybersecurity and hybrid threats. Isabel, please could you tell a little bit more about the perspective of Spain, also its role as the presidency of the European Union?
Thank you, Caroline, and buenas tardes a todos. I'm really happy to be here and to be talking about this topic. So as Spain and the very close connection that we have with Latin America is a very strong partnership that we already have with them. We thought it was only natural for us during our presidency in the EU to just bring that together and try to go a step further in what capacity building already meant for the EU in Latin America. So, of course, in this backdrop that our colleagues were already talking about, we think that, of course, we have to understand the region as not as homogeneous as everybody might want to think. So we want to have this tailored perspective, as well as this risk of fragmentation that is already happening in cyberspace. So we want to find this balance between the two. So how do we manage to have a tailored approach in a fragmented cyberspace, avoiding further fragmentation by ourselves? And how do we do that? We think that it's all the ways of capacity building, both bilaterally and regionally and multilaterally, have to complement each other. So capacity building has to happen in several levels. So we do have this already very strong connection in projects on the ground bilaterally, as through our national cybersecurity institute, and we already have bilaterals with the countries in Latin America, where we talk about how they can implement their own national security strategies, cybersecurity strategies. We do have a very decentralized model in Spain, so that can also help with a variety of countries that also have struggles to find the possibility of having a national cybersecurity agency, which is very hard to come up to. And also we think that having these multilateral dialogues that we have in the UN and all the outreach that comes along with it is crucial to align our positions in the UN and in general ITU, so on, we think that we have to find a way to converge our standards somehow. And that also goes through region to region collaboration, right? So we thought that during our presidency, we would go through that door and try to further strengthen that region to region strong connection. And in that way, we already had, for example, in July, it was a bi-regional EU-Americas dialogue on cyber and cybersecurity and digital diplomacy. And the idea was to bring together all POCs from those regions in their MFA, so from capital, that are already dealing with cybersecurity, to have them come and know their counterparts in the EU, and just exchange their views on the challenges that we all face, because so many of these challenges are the same, or we already have had them in the past, so we just have to build from there, right? So in that situation, we had them talk openly about their needs, and it was really very interesting to see how they perceive the EU and our evolution as well, and what their needs are. So for example, there was kind of a criticism about who to call in the EU, which is very common. We've been talking about that a lot, so yeah. But yes, it was also very genuine conversation about how to structure in their own nations, in their own countries, their POCs and the coordination, the internal coordination, which I think is a challenge for everyone. I know that Spain is also struggling with that. So we just had these exchanges. Also with a training perspective, so in Spain, we already have this cyber bootcamp that we collaborate with the OAS with, and the US as well every year. And it's very interesting to see how we try to train experts in various fields of cybersecurity. So not only CSIRTs, so IT experts, law enforcement, the judicial system, but also policymakers. And we're trying now to maybe put cyber diplomacy in there in a way to just level up all the perspectives of cyber capacity building. And so these are some of the ways that we feel like further elaborating on the cyber diplomacy or cyber dialogues that the EU already has going on, and maybe the cyber skills framework that is starting to shape itself in the EU, that could lead to some collaborations region to region, and that's our hope, that maybe that would allow us to converge a little bit more on that field. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. Next to you is Lina Areng, Director of EU CyberNet, who has really a hands-on experience of managing a program which actually adapts cyber capacity building to the different contexts there. In particular, considering that from sometimes you think in the European Union, okay, this is one region, probably every country is approximately a little bit the same, a bit different. But as every region, they're very complex. It's a very complex situation in every country. So, Lina, yes, as I said, you manage the EU CyberNet regional cybersecurity program, and the creation of the regional cybersecurity and cybercrime competence center in the Dominican Republic. But you can tell a little bit more about which countries you're working in, and how do you tackle the issue or the challenge of tailoring and demand-driven capacity building from a EU perspective as well.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you, Rusi, for hosting us in your new beautiful home. Delighted to be here. Latin American Caribbean Cyber Competence Center, LAC4, is in a way a blueprint for European Union, because it's the first regional cyber competence center that EU helps to establish and operationalize. And that shows a lot of how much potential there is in the region. And also, as Carlos said, it is also a complement and acknowledgement of the rapid digital transformation, which also brings along challenges in cybersecurity, which necessarily doesn't have to be the case. And this is how LAC4 intends to contribute to the region, by raising awareness, skills, and providing opportunities for the countries to collaborate amongst each other and within the country, and also across borders. But of course, this opportunity or possibility doesn't mean the ability, but I guess we will cover that perhaps a little bit later. A few words about LAC4, what we are, what we do. So since our inauguration in 2022, we have carried out more than 50 cyber capacity building activities, not only in Santo Domingo, in Dominican Republic, where the physical training center is located, but across the whole region. And our specific focus has been on incident response, crisis management, information security, and also cyber diplomacy, amongst others. And we have also provided support to some policy making and legislative efforts in the region, because we consider that with the consolidated knowledge from the EU, with the NIS directive and other regulatory experiences, that might broaden the horizons for the LAC region, and they can choose their own best way to develop their national legislation. And this year we also organized 4 cybersecurity tabletop exercises, regional ones or sub-regional ones, because we consider that exercises are the best way to raise the preparedness and skills and communication aspects, because it's always better to preempt the crisis and to improve your skills before the actual very bad day happens. But obviously we're all humans and not cyborgs, and we like to learn from our own mistakes and not of those of the others. The event is called Bridging Digital Borders, and this is what we try to do at LAC4. We try to build a bridge between LAC and EU, a knowledge bridge, and this is not a one-way lane, because it needs to be two-way knowledge exchange or knowledge transfer, because the region is becoming increasingly aware, knowledgeable, innovative, and smart. And we consider that we also have a lot to learn from the region. And we hope that this bridge will one day hold a true highway between the two regions, because we share the same values and the same vision and the same challenges as well. One important element, obviously, we collaborate with the regional stakeholders and partners, with UK, with Canada, with US, OIS, CARICOM Impacts, and other important stakeholders. Because we want our project to have a lasting and sustainable impact, and we want to assure the complementarity of the existing efforts in the region, and therefore we consider the further alignment of the policy goals and knowledge of the other stakeholders in the region very essential. Although LAC4 was created by the EU, the aim is to become one day a multinationally supported and sponsored entity. And therefore, we know that cybersecurity requires international collaborative approach and also agile collaboration formats. And we hope that LAC4 will be a nexus of such national, international, or collaboration that comprises national, international, public-private efforts. And to build stronger resilience and interoperability amongst the countries. We were speaking also about the transformative elements of cyber capacity building, and we hope that one day the center will have more a face of the region, because transformation is first and foremost human, and then it is digital. And when EU CyberNet received the task to create such a regional center, or to develop a concept of a regional cyber competence center, then we looked at other examples, and we came as close as the NATO Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn. And of course, the geopolitical context and socio-political realities on the ground are very different. And as was mentioned earlier, the Euro-Atlantic region is much more homogeneous, although we of course have our differences. But in the Euro-Atlantic region, I think what we share is that that we have no one else to turn to for cyber capacity building. This is our job to keep our house in order and also to assist others in order to be a respected, responsible and acknowledged player or partner in cybersecurity. And we hope also that by joining LAC 4, it will improve the countries of the region ability to have a word or contribute to the cybersecurity of the region. And this is of course happening already slowly but steadily. What Karian was sharing with us, there's a lot of collaboration already going on amongst the CSIRTs, thanks to the CSIRTs Americas community. There is more collaboration also happening and coordination happening at on the cyber diplomacy front. And because, of course, it's there's a difference. If Toomas from Estonia is sharing experiences with Latin America, it's one thing. But if it's a person from the region who knows the bloodstream of the region, it has a completely different meaning. So we're trying also to incorporate local expertise to our capacity building endeavors. And to continue, or to conclude rather than to continue, is that we hope that that all players in the region consider LAC 4 as a partner. We are there to support, to share the burden of cyber capacity building, to fill the gaps where we can, and to join in the pooling and sharing efforts of all the donors and implementers. And I'm sure that together we can do much more.
Thank you very much, Nina. Now we'll introduce Arthur David. He's a Foreign Service Officer with the International Cyber Policy Division at Global Affairs Canada. For over 5 years, he has been primarily working on advancing Canada's cyber interests at the United Nations First Committee within the Open Working Group. Currently leads on Canada's cyber policy to NATO and the OSCE, coordination of cyber capacity building efforts to Ukraine, and is responsible for European geographic files. So this is your background or your role, kind of like you have also this picture from the different regions, and but particular from your own region. And yeah, can you describe it, like your view on this? And also, I think this is very interesting program. I think you're talking about building bridges. It's a very interesting program to bridge the gender gap. And yeah, we would like to hear about this and how this is relevant for the region in particular.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you for inviting, and it's a pleasure to represent Canada in this panel as well too. And I think my career essentially was born out of a MC, a memorandum to cabinet that was approved with the notion and the idea to implement, but also support the international framework for responsible state behavior. And that's been the onus of Canada's efforts in these advocacy engagements, and not only the OAS, the Latin American region, but as you said, throughout my career, I think I've had my hand in almost every single pie, the OAS, the EU, obviously, the OSCE, NATO, and the RF as well. So these areas have been quite relevant in terms of not only lessons learned and how to implement these capacity building efforts, but also seeing how these different regions operate themselves and their own efforts and how states interact within those spaces too. So if we're thinking back to some of the earliest examples, I mean, if we go back to 2019, for instance, and I'm not sure if Karian's still on the line, but one of the very first examples of cyber moving to the speed of trust was exactly that exchange of information and best practices. And so we, along with the OAS and the ARF, were able to combine a workshop on legislation for cyber security laws, but also institutions and legislation to enforce those institutions. And so this was a unique aspect because being part of the OAS region, we were able to take Caribbean states and go to the Pacific region to share that expertise and knowledge and lessons learned with island nations there, because ideally, geographically, they will have the same amount of limited resources, people on the ground, knowledge and expertise. And so they are the best placed to give that. So given that, you know, Kat said in the opening statement, it would be very nice to be in a position to have an unlimited chest and unlimited funds to run around the world and give as much money as you want. Unfortunately, that's not the reality, definitely not in Canada. So what we try to do is really tailor those efforts. And by doing that, we really try to see what it is exactly that those recipients would need. And we try to match that up basically with what's available as well. I think this is one aspect that sometimes is overlooked in the matching and trying to see where the gaps can be filled, is to see what's available. And so working with these multilateral regions and partners, it's a treasure trove of information that's readily available and ready to share. And then the lessons and the products that come out of that actually, I would say, speak for themselves. For instance, from those workshops that we were able to undertake, we've seen much more activity and proactivity, I would say, both in terms of just regular cyber hygiene, also defensive cyber means, but also engagement in multilateral forums within their multilateral region, actually becoming vocal voices, not only for their own states, but to, again, uphold the normative framework for responsible state behavior. On the backdrop of that, it's also highly political. What happens there is, and obviously the main space which this is being discussed is at the UN, at the Cyber Open-Ended Working Group, where we are still trying to figure out exactly some of these questions, where some states and even some regions are saying, well, what does happen in incident response cases, for instance? Who do we look to in order for receiving that assistance, but also working together to ensuring that we can be more proactive in this space. Depending on who you ask and how the discussions have been going, there are different models, there are different organizations already doing this. Not everyone agrees on the path to go. There's lots of multi-stakeholders that have their presence and expertise that have lended themselves to do this, but we don't have an answer to that yet. And so it's very important, at least from that multilateral fora, for those discussions to keep going to get to an answer, and to get to an answer that I think where everyone is mutually benefiting from this, where it's not just one version versus the other. It needs to make sense in that case. And lastly, on the gender gap. So one of, again, the, I guess the chief objectives that we've had in this is also advancing the Women, Peace and Security agenda for Canada, but also for other states, because I think when we first started this initiative, a lot of states asked us, okay, what it is exactly that you're trying to do with gender inclusion and cybersecurity. We ourselves weren't sure. And so what we were able to do is commission research to look into this and share those results. They're available still to this day on the OEWG portal. We partnered up with the Women's League of International League of Peace and Freedom that were able to provide recommendations at a base layer of how states can incorporate gender considerations into cybersecurity strategies, exercises, because these were some aspects that, again, they were human-centric that weren't being really factored into both how states conduct their own capacity building, but even the discussions in multilateral fora. And so I'm happy to say that Canada, along with the UK and other donors, we were able to fund the Women in Cyber Fellowship, which is still going strong. It's still growing, and it is bearing fruit in terms of managing not only the expectations of those states that are part of the fellowship, but also shaping the conversations themselves. Because we're seeing, in 2020, we were able to reach gender parity, probably the best thing that came out from that year. And so we're hoping to not only just increase the participation of that, but the meaningful participation of women in these spaces. And so I think this is just the start again. And again, from 2018 onwards, we'll get into the, I guess, the past questions and looking into the future where we can improve on some of this experience that we've had so far.
Thank you very much. So we now heard a lot about partnership, tailored approaches, demand-driven, region-to-region cooperation. So, Carlos, I see you're taking very notes the whole time to probably challenge some of these very good intentions and also the implementation. So you would like to take?
Yes, no, very briefly, I'm conscious of time, and I think there's a great conversation out here about policy transfer, right? So, but there's no recipe on policy transfer, even if we don't speak about cyber, if we speak about other very important issues about broadly understanding security or broadly issues that affect Latin America the most. So the case that always struggles me is the case of Mexico, which has dedicated so much money to its security apparatus. But when you look at the cyber, the cyber issue in Mexico is not the same as other issues, right? So policy transfer, I think is locked into different boxes in which states need to unlock, the way forward. And I think that's why at least OAS is very mindful about being tailored. And I think that's why also, and it's great to hear that the UK thinks that, the NCSC model doesn't translate quite easily to the rest of Latin America. I mean, the whole conversation about who leads on intelligence or who leads on policing and crime is a massive conversation. And then you look at Brazil as such an important player, and the military is actually leading on cybersecurity in certain aspects, and it depends on how you look at the governance grand scheme of cybersecurity. So I think my main questions to that side of the panel, of course, is always how to speed up this attempt to come up with policy transfer without diluting into creating a special program for Chile, then a special program for Argentina, and so on. So what are the commonalities of certain things that work out in some of these countries, are what are those definitely no areas in which you just don't create a policy program for Argentina based on Chilean on the way the state works. So I also think that this room has a strong emphasis on ministries of foreign affairs, and that's not always also the reality about cybersecurity in the region. I think because of the and the index of OAS is very telling in this, in telling you how much certain areas have advanced in the region in comparison to others. So when you have a lot of legislation, for instance, it means that these countries are very good at sitting together in parliament and say, we have a problem of internet crime and so on, so we're going to pass a law. But then how do you create institutions after law has been passed? So I think that's definitely a moment that my colleagues on the other side of the panel are trying to pinpoint, right? So how do we jump into that second and third wave of cybersecurity governance, in which we really need to separate the weed from what's really important in these countries and what really works. And just to close on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs things, is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs the most important and relevant agent to go and chat to in Latin America? And then again, the case of Brazil, you have Itamaraty, which is huge, a lot of knowledge, a lot of resources and so on. But then you jump into some other delegations and some other diplomatic bodies, which are way smaller, and they don't have the same power as ministries of internal security or ministries of defense. So I think I now pass the ball to the other side of the table, and I leave those questions open so that we can move forward.
Just want to add that we're going to have some Q&A at the end. There are also going to be some Q&A probably from the online audience. So I tried to take those in the last 5 to 10 minutes. Yeah, so if anyone wants to speak, and maybe also so considering this, like, is the MFA the right? Who are the other relevant players? And like also, how does it impact the funder-recipient relationship? And how do you, maybe you've also from your experience, like how do you work with your partners? Considering also maybe the different kind of, realms, communities, cyber capacity is happening. I don't know who wants to take Isabel? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So in our experience in Spain, we have multiple players, multiple authorities that are competent for different things in cybersecurity. So how we coordinate ourselves is through National Cybersecurity Council. But everyone else, so Ministry of Telecommunications, Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we all have our own competences. So when we deal with our bilateral collaboration with other states, we are trying to put them in in this context that we have these consultations, bilateral consultations with multiple authorities, because we think that it depends on what sector of cybersecurity you want to tackle. You most probably want to speak directly to the authority that is competent with it. So in our case, if you're trying to focus on public-private partnership, which is something that we do in Spain, we have a specific forum for cyber public-private partnership. You might want to talk to the authorities that are more competent with the CSERT for private entities, for example, which is our National Institute for Cybersecurity. But if you want to deal with our joint cyber command in defense and talk about cyber defense, then it's our Ministry of Defense. And if it's the public CSERT for the public entities, it's our intelligence service. So it varies a lot. And the MFA, I don't think, is the only one or the best speaker for that. But it is true that it has to come into consideration as well, because one of the things that we saw is it's really nowhere to be found sometimes. And it's very hard to have these conversations in the UN at the multilateral level or even regional level if you don't have a coordinator for that. So if you go further from the incident response, which is maybe where you would find all these multiple authorities, if you go to the multilateral and cyber diplomacy realm, you would have to go through the MFA. So that's what we were trying to do, for example, in Leon, is just figure out who to talk to in the MFAs, whereas a whole thing, we had to talk to the OAS and the US and figure this out for a few months, because it was hard to find the specific person in MFAs in Latin America that would eventually just have this portfolio. Sometimes they were really not in the MFA. There's just someone in the National Cybersecurity Agency or just someone in New York, which is sometimes the case. So we're trying to make them understand how important it is that they have this this position as well, because that would allow for an informal network that we, for example, have in the EU. We do have a coordination, some sort of coordination informally through our MFAs, and that works a lot for our positioning in multilateralism. So I do believe that it's just complementary. It's not the main actor, of course not. It's just one of them that has been overlooked for a long time.
So Lina, yeah, so it's interesting if it's an enabler or rather like a constraint for capacity building, but what you described is rather positive. Lina, I don't know, do you support this or?
Of course, yes. The European side of the house, yes, we can't disagree. But of course, there are no angels or demons in the national cybersecurity framework. So you have to collaborate with everybody, include everybody, no matter how difficult or time-consuming it is. And this is what we try to project also to our beneficiary countries, that this is a process. And then countries that sometimes are not very well experienced with developing a national cybersecurity strategy or legislation. They want to do it really quickly, and when they don't involve all the necessary stakeholders, then the result will not be long-lived. And EU is very much supportive of a thing called needs-based needs-based multi-stakeholder approach, which basically means that you need to focus in cyber capacity building also outside government, academia, civil society, private sector. And this also helps with these political issues sometimes that when the government change, then these other actors usually overlive the government, and that helps the cyber capacity building endeavors to be more sustainable. And this is I guess something that we have learned through our activities, and that is not specific to Latin America only, but also other regions, and I guess back home as well.
I feel like I have little left to add to that. Canada is not part of the EU, as you know. Although I was asked if we are thinking of applying, there's a spot open, so maybe. But essentially, I don't think it really matters where the counterparts are having their discussions. I think as long as they are coordinating amongst themselves, at least from the domestic side, and then vice versa, I think whether it's your internal agencies, your signal agencies, the MFA types, it really depends on the type of discussion. And I think that calculus is made in-house and it's probably made correctly. But if we're thinking about, and the earlier point about moving along a bit further, maybe at the speed of cyber, and seeing the implementation or the results of these discussions, I think that also needs to be realistic in the sense that, especially if we're taking the MFA strand, for instance, diplomacy takes a long time. Diplomacy takes trust. And only once you've established this trust, do you start seeing the results. And sometimes the results aren't really open-ended. A lot of times they're closed. They're closed doors, not on purpose, but just because it's just, it's an easier working level method for a lot of these states sometimes to work. I mean, perfect example for Canada, when we've worked with our South American partners in the region, we've had tremendous success and feedback and cooperation with Chile, with Colombia, with Argentina, with Mexico. And this isn't coming from another ulterior agenda. It's literally because we have the same issues. We have some of the same problems. We have a lot of similarities within our systems, within the MFA, within the Ministry of Defense, and we have a lot of knowledge that we've shared with each other in this space. And so we're always trying to achieve a common goal and objective in these areas, whether it be through UN negotiations or multilateral negotiations. Perfect example that I can give was the last confidence building measures working group in Mexico City. You know, we never go out of our way to launch, you know, initiatives that we want to give the lead to the South American partners, but we were asked by our Chilean and Mexican representatives and counterparts there to come over and basically join their initiatives. So this is quite an interesting aspect, because traditionally when we think of capacity building frameworks, you know, you always think it's north-south, south-south. It never really goes south-north. But this is the model really that we think would be beneficial and replicated elsewhere. The perfect example that Isabel gave too was the OAS and the EU regional dialogue and conversation, which again was tremendous in terms of the information exchange, especially from a south-north, north-north perspective as well. This is very useful and handy to have, because then again, domestically, that information is disseminated outwards to respective programs and respective kind of branches that cybersecurity hits as well. For Canada, internally, we've tried so hard to keep cyber in the box, but try as hard as you want, it will disseminate its way further. And it's almost a flip side of digital as well.
I just would like to ask one question. Is it was not discussed, but I think it maybe fits quite well, because I was just at an event this morning just across the road at the Foreign Office, and we discussed the impact of like that suddenly we have Russia invading Ukraine. They needed a very quick support, and like there was not a lot of time to prepare capacity building. It had to happen quickly and the next day, and somehow the donors had to coordinate very quickly. So when I know Brian, if you have, so just to look at you because I want to add something to this. What does it mean for cyber capacity building if we have, you know, you said that cyber diplomacy needs a long time. It's a long building relationships, establishing centers and hubs and etc. Which takes a long time. But what in the face of something like happening in Ukraine or happening in other countries, in a big attacks of Costa Rica, other countries. So,
yeah, no, I mean, I'll touch on it briefly.
Yeah.
I think that in the spirit of your question is that we tend to react in this space, right? That a lot of, you know, sort of contemporary capacity building in cyberspace is a reaction to the speed of cyber. The fact that it's proliferating so fast and we're trying to catch up. And that's not just, sort of the places in which we're attempting to strengthen capacity, but also at our own home institutions in which we're still, chasing to stay with the speed of tech evolution. And in the context of what you cited in Costa Rica and Ecuador, I mean, there's lots of cases in the region in which those countries are reacting very fast to an incident, and they're trying to pull partners in to help support building comprehensive capacity to deal with further attacks, right? And that's been the spirit of those kind of reactive approaches. The challenge is we don't necessarily have to go about it that way. I mean, there's a really, sophisticated and methodologically sound, capacity building framework or frameworks that's on the shelf. It's just adapting that expertise to be able to deploy it, I think, in an appropriate way is where the challenge is. And I think, Carrie Ann brought up a few things, and I can certainly talk, from the US perspective and some of the challenges we have is, one is alignment, just making sure that not alignment purely in institutional alignment, which is a challenge, right? Carlos brings up an excellent point. And that is, for years now, military institutions in Latin America have been vying to be sort of in the spot of taking some degree of leadership in the cyber domain. Those militaries, by the way, and I've written extensively on this, are going through their own identity challenges in terms of what threats do they address in the 21st century if there's an absence of interstate conflict. How do they get involved in domestic security, and where does cyber fit, and where do the resources for that go? And in the US, it's not, capacity building is not, exclusively in the US military. In fact, it's actually, spearheaded in the Department of State. And even in the US, the Department of State and Department of Defense conflict over who's going to be the tip of the spear in terms of, leveraging cyber as a diplomatic tool, right? And so you have those challenges of alignment, even in context. I mean, in terms of content, a lot of times, what we're finding is partners in Latin America are asking for things that we feel really uncomfortable training. When you get into the discussion over defensive and offensive cyber, right? US has been very, adamant about not going too far into the offensive cyber space and trying to keep in the defense space, but you're getting a lot of security institutions that are requesting more on the offensive cyberspace. So there's some alignment issues there as well. Resources, Carrie Ann brought up an excellent point, and that is oftentimes we're resourcing capacity building, year to year. And that doesn't allow, and to your point about reacting, that doesn't allow for a longer term sustainable approach to investing in capacity enhancements across the region. And then not sort of shifting based on where the fire is. That's the other challenge that we run into. There's probably a list of 100 more challenges that we run into. And why, by the way, I think the reactive, and as you point out, and I think that was the origin of the question, was, the reacting to crisis seems to be the biggest driver of, increasing capacity building, at least the demands for it. And I think that, that can be problematic in terms of sustainability. I'm not even sure, the structural issues of who owns cyber is fully worked out. And so it, again, that demand for reacting is I think problematic. Something.
Thank you so much. We have 7 minutes left. This was quite quickly, but I would like to ask all of you, maybe we could short reflection on what if you could start over again as a community 10 years back, like what is a major thing we maybe would change and would inform future capacity building? If you have one wish, like what could it be, or suggestion? Maybe we start from that end of the table.
So 10 years back, well, I'm 10 years smarter now, I guess, but maybe on the element of trust that was discussed here and how to treat your partners. And I remember that 10 years ago, under my national hat in the Estonian National Cybersecurity Center, we were struggling on getting accepted to this rather exclusive elite CSERT network of the European governmental CSERTs, and it was very difficult to get accepted. And but in 2016, the NIS directive created this CSERT network that allowed all European Union CSERTs to exchange information and collaborate. So they created a collaboration tool, and then very convenient, in 2017, Estonia held the EU presidency when when WannaCry and NotPetya happened, and the CSIRT network was just established, and there were no technical tools to exchange information. And so our CSIRT lended their own collaboration tool called Mattermost, and that helped to bring all these European CSIRTs around the same virtual campfire to exchange information and create this whole of EU situational awareness picture. So basically, it means that if you share information, then it doesn't only benefit the others, but it benefits you as well. And back then, maybe the information sharing culture was different. Today's it has changed and improved. So I would just like to say that do not underestimate your partners in the beneficiary countries. That if it is a partnership, then the results are much more better, much better.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it's a journey, so it takes time. Anyways.
Isabel?
So I think I haven't been working on cyber for that long, but I think that I would say that everything revolves around awareness. So awareness is really at the center of everything else, be it cyber incident response or the institutional organization or even trust and cyber diplomacy. And I think it took us too long to be aware of the threat of those vulnerabilities, not only on the business side, but then after that on the governmental institutions and in the end on the everyday citizens, right? So I think 10 years ago, I would have said that maybe we would have to try to make the political elite way more aware of those vulnerabilities sooner so that we could have a more proactive approach and not only the reactive one.
I would say almost similarly, I only started 5 years ago, but if I had to go back 5 years, I'd say save money. And then go back 5 more years and say save even more money. But realistically, no, it's only because at least within our system, when we first started out in 2018, capacity building hadn't really been at the forefront. And there's great stats. I mean, if you go on the Sybil portal, for instance, you'll see the graphs, they all point up and they keep pointing up. So that's just a reality of not only just partners that we work with, but just the global majority writ large is saying capacity building is the key to advancing cyberspace, but also we would like to think the normative framework for responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And Isabel touched on a few points that I would also highlight is to say, what we'd like also to have maybe is a market of proactivity rather than reacting to a lot of these incidences. And obviously that takes not just a government or MFA approach, but a whole of society approach, very similar to other issues that our countries are battling, climate change, for instance. And only that, but a lot of these initiatives that we're undergoing, they're the first time we're doing it. There's no other playbook that's been written beforehand on this. There are some maybe kinetic lines that we can draw lessons learned from, but we are kind of advancing imagery wise, flying the plane and building it at the same time. But in that aspect, I'd say framework wise, that is also something that we're trying to keep in mind. And maybe going forward, obviously, as a lot of these multilateral discussions move forward, they will be reflected into the conversations. And then obviously in the background of that, quickly to your point on the war in Ukraine, that is something that is very much at the forefront of a lot of partners that we're working with. And as I mentioned before, we don't try to take onus of any of these discussions. We look to regional partners really to lead on that. And so in that aspect, Eastern Europe and the Baltics are crucial in that aspect, and we look to them to that as well.
All right, so if there's one thing, and I think this marks my 10th year actually working on cyber, which started in the U.S. government, but different from what was said, I think maybe far more intentionality early on to disaggregate universal cyber education and sort of building a culture among digital natives and cyber technical expertise. I think we've lumped all of that together for much of the training we've done in the early years, and I would be far more intentional about disaggregating it. And then with that, I would have made more investments in early universal cyber education. If you really wanted to change culture, which I think is where we want to go with sort of absorbing, cyber norms in cyberspace and a better appreciation and respect for the threats and power of cyberspace, we would dump more resources into educating in the K through 12 space to condition young people to move into either careers or at least be, appreciative of the threats in that landscape. So I would disaggregate those two early, and I'd make more investments on the early childhood universal cyber education front.
Yeah, so I went further than 10 years, just to a place where Latin America sits in 2013. I think 1993, it gets published, Cyber War is Coming, of the RAND Corporation by Aquila and Ronfeld. There's not a word about Latin America in it. Then 2013, its most famous response by Thomas Reed, Cyber War will not take place. 2013, there's also not a word about Latin America. I think we all became in love with this once OAS and the IDB published Cybersecurity, Are We Ready in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is kind of like the Bible for this. That's only in 2016, so that's even less than 10 years ago. And just because my colleagues from FYU are here, in 2018, at the Latin American Studies Association, which is the largest and it congregates 5,000 researchers on many Latin American topics, there was only one panel on internet, digital society, whatever you want to call it. And there was literally Randy, this guy, and myself, and someone else from Chile, and Carolina. I have to acknowledge her. There was literally 4 people out of 4,000 who were literally trying to engage with the theme. So I think we've come up a long way. Finally, we're having this at RUSI, so that's fantastic. And I think there's plenty more research to do. And in 2013, I was writing my PhD about something else. Maybe I should have changed topics, but I'm glad on how it turned out, just because you guys are here helping us decipher what it is what we need to move forward. So yeah, thank you.
It all seems like ages ago, decades ago, but I mean more than one decade. But yeah, I think the landscape has evolved. The challenges become more difficult. But just want to summarize. I think there's all things which are still very valid: information sharing, partnership, tailored approaches, investing. We have one question which I couldn't get. There was a question: who can sponsor developing a legislation in Mexico? So asking for funding, being proactive, responsible state behavior, cyber education, awareness and skills, something that probably very important, came up this morning a lot as well. So yeah, thank you very much. I think what it shows is like actually probably maybe the different regions are closer than we think. The challenges are some similar. We still have to look really into every kind of context. Context is key. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives. Really interesting. And maybe is there any questions from the audience? We just running 4 minutes over time, but I think if there's someone really wants to ask something, otherwise I think there's a lot of opportunity in the next in the coffee break, exactly, and I think also later today. Thank you so much. Yeah.
And sorry, just a quick point, since we ran over, 4:30 back over here, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here and joining us again for this afternoon. I am certainly cognizant that I am the last thing between you and your alcoholic beverage of choice. And for those of you online, probably have an alcoholic beverage of choice right in front of you while you're taking notes. Very excited to moderate this panel along with these fantastic speakers and thought leaders in this space. Up to this point, we've talked a lot about external non-regional actors. And what we wanted to do was really take a more Latin American perspective to understanding the different dynamics that are happening within the region. And I can't think of any other group of speakers I'd rather have than these three right here. I will introduce them very briefly in the order in which they will speak. First, of course, it really needs no introduction here. Luis Maria Harrell is a research fellow at RUSI's cyber team and currently leading their efforts in responsible cyber behavior. A number of different affiliations, one of which is non-resident scholar at FIU. I'm biased, I think it's the best affiliation. Obviously advisor GFCE and a number of other institutions like London School of Economics as well. Speaking next, my friend from Brazil here, Marcelo Malaguti, who is currently a special advisor to the Ministry of International Security Office within the Presidency of the Republic of Brazil. And here he coordinates the development of national cybersecurity policy, extremely relevant to this discussion here that we're going to have here briefly. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Joe Devani, a lecturer at the Department of War Studies at King's College London and the Deputy Director of the Center for Defense Studies at King's. So I've asked each of our speakers to take approximately 5 to 7 minutes worth of remarks on this broad initial discussion. So I've asked them to discuss what have been the most significant challenges that you've seen within Latin American countries in developing that centralized national cybersecurity governance model over the past few years. We've talked a lot earlier today about the need for that coordinating body and that designated agency. But I'd love to hear from you. What do you see as the most significant challenges these countries have faced in that development? So Luis, if I can start with you.
Wonderful. Hopefully you can hear me okay also online. So I think, yes, as you alluded to, Randy, I think there is a history across countries in Latin America of where do they develop their capacity and how do they develop their cybersecurity governance models. I think a lot of it has gone through the development of national cybersecurity strategies throughout the past couple of years. The OES has been a key, partner in kind of facilitating that capacity development. But I think as Carlos started to talk about, first wave or second wave, I think we're at a second wave right now over in Latin American countries. And for some of them, they're, even further, you could say, in thinking about what's next now that they have a national cybersecurity strategy, now that some of them are actually in a second iteration of their national cybersecurity strategy, what does it mean in terms of actually consolidating that and institutionalizing that? For some countries, it like the capacities, and I can say about Brazil and maybe others, where you see the concentration of capacities very much in the Ministry of Defense, but that is not solely the case, as Marcelo will probably talk about in just a couple of minutes. But you would also see a lot of that going in ministries of economy throughout the region, and also, let's say, other ministries that take on the lead of developing, cybersecurity nationally and coordinating that. But I think when we think about the last year of succession of different incidents, I think we're all a bit tired of even talking about Costa Rica. We were talking about that yesterday, Randy, of oh, please don't talk about Costa Rica again. Not, to diminish what happened in Costa Rica, but I think, there's so many other incidents that we've been seeing. I mean, in Brazil, we've seen numerous kind of incidents and, targeted attacks actually against the Ministry of the Superior Electoral Court right before the elections in 2020. The municipal elections, I should say, in 2020. So I think there's some things that become internationally visible, and that then we can kind of trace why, there's some institutional developments following that. There's some things that we kind of don't quite trace at the international level. So I think there's an opportunity here to kind of shed some light on that. And again, so I think in the past year, following a lot of these ransomware incidents, more specifically, most of the countries have been thinking about developing their national cybersecurity agency, right? So Mexico has tried to pass a bill more recently. You have Costa Rica trying to pass a bill as well, couldn't manage to do that. You have Chile discussing right now a national cybersecurity agency as part of a bill nationally being proposed. Brazil as well, and you do have outliers such as Uruguay that has had, a national cybersecurity, not agency, but they have an agency for, electronic government and all of that, that does have the cert within that since 2006, which is a phenomenal kind of example of an outlier. I don't want to talk a lot because, we'll be able to unpack a little bit more in this panel, some of the layers of what I'm talking about. But in terms of challenges, I'd say when thinking about this second wave of institutional development in Latin America and thinking about the development of national cybersecurity agencies that are being proposed, we really need to think about the first Achilles heel, which definitely is the financing of these agencies, right? I think, for every proposal, in addition to being able to pass the legislation that will effectively get to the agency state, is talking and having a public debate about how they're going to be financed. So in Costa Rica, when they proposed, and this was just a couple of months after the Conti ransomware incident, when they proposed a bill to establish a national cybersecurity agency, one of the proposals was that every ministry should contribute with 1.5% of their budget to finance this agency. And that is precisely where it died. Because when you talk about money, that's when you're getting to the sensitive topic about, developing countries. And this is definitely not unique to Latin America, but it's definitely where we should think concretely about where to start the conversation about challenges, very practical challenges that speak to those that even don't understand cyber, right? The policymakers that sometimes need to reflect on that. And then there's the case of Brazil, which I'm sure Marcelo will be able to talk a little bit more about that, where you didn't necessarily have within the bill that's being kind of discussed right now, a specification of how it would be funded. But at the end of the day, there were lots of conversations gravitating around this, that there would be like an extra tax on top of internet users that would be used to fund the agency. And that was never kind of actually put there in the bill. That was never actually discussed. But that is part of, let's say, the political dynamics of how other interest groups at the national level seek to also kind of change the conversation or to mind sometimes the conversation around a national cybersecurity agency, because of those, let's say, Achilles heels that I've been alluding to. And the second point, and I'm mindful of my time, please nod and say stop talking. But the second point I would say is really a lack of trust and understanding of what an agency means at the national level. I don't think this is unique to Latin America, but I think there's some aspects that really kind of go at the core of the history of where the cybersecurity discussion has evolved in Latin America, which is in the MODs most of the times. And it's easier for the public debate also to understand, the army or, a joint cyber command is actually taking part because they have cyber, right? So it's easier to kind of get that. And I think that has stuck to many public conversations. And when I think about trust, many civil society organizations fear that, the development of a national cybersecurity agency could be, actually doing content moderation, doing content control. And that is not an unfounded concern because, as it has been reported throughout the past couple of years, Mexico, even Brazil and other countries have an interest in commercial hacking tools, in developing cyber capabilities and outsourcing via these other, let's say, tools, not all of them Pegasus. So we have a history of hacking team selling some capabilities to countries in Latin America. So that is one way of thinking about that distrust that has historically been there in many ways. And also the history of the military dictatorships in Latin America. That is also something that's really at the core of trying to rebuild trust. But at the other end, there's also some unfounded kind of concerns when it comes to that. So that is also played politically in many ways. So in Colombia, the proposal also for a national cybersecurity agency, one of the critiques that you could say that circulated in the public discourse was that, it would be an agency that Petro would use to surveil individuals, right? And that's not the case of building a national cybersecurity agency, and that's not the purpose of the National Cybersecurity Agency. But there are other colleagues from Mexico, let's say, that have evaluated the Mexican proposal, and they have actually seen specifications to actually go through content. So that is a real concern. So there's a trust element that needs to be very much calibrated as we think about the future and how a national cybersecurity agency within the context of Latin America, given this history, that it can position itself as a credible coordinator in the realities of different countries. So I'll just stop there and I can talk more later.
Thank you, Luis. Marcelo.
Well, I had one disclaimer to do, but after hearing Luis, I had two actually. The first one I have to put ahead is I don't speak English well, so you have to forgive me. I'll do my best. But the second one, it was the first before, is I don't speak in the name of the Brazilian government. I'm just an advisor to the minister, and he's wise enough not to hear me sometimes. So that said, we have been working for the last months, like 8 months, in the Brazilian government, trying to write a national cyber policy and to illuminate, to inform our national security, cybersecurity strategy. We had a previous cybersecurity strategy from 2020, but not informed by a national policy. And in the Brazilian doctrine, it is necessary to have a policy informing a national strategy. You are not able to do something strategically if you don't know where you want to go. So this is why we have changed the conception and started working with the national cyber policy first. Then we had to understand something that was in my thesis, in my doctorate thesis, that is the Brazilian strategic culture or the Brazilian historic institutionalism and the way things are in Brazilian culture, and we cannot work against it. So we have to deal with it. And the main issue is we have a problem in the civilian-military relationship. And I guess the first country that worked with the military branch and the civilian branch at the same time was France in 2009, I guess. But everywhere else, there was a branch, a military branch working before, and then the civilian part. You can see this in the United States and here in the UK and so on. So Brazil was not different. In 2010, we started working with the military. And in 2014, after Snowden revelations, we have started discussing the Brazilian National Agency, a civilian one, but in a very Brazilian way. Let's start talking and keep talking and go talking, and no decision taken until the beginning of this year when they said, okay, Marcelo, you have been criticizing us for a long time, so come here and try to do better. And well, I was happy, and now I know. Then we had to start talking with Brazilian branches inside the government, and it was very interesting because talking to the military was easy, talking to the diplomats also easy, talking to the telecom regulations agency was quite easy. But talking to the civilian coordination in the government was tricky, because when you write something, some way they say, oh, this is too much military. Okay, so let's change the words, and so this is not that much military. But what do we want? How should I write it to fit okay, to be okay? So that said, we had to listen our friends in different countries. UK is very present there. They went there and, oh, why don't you try this? You see, it's not going to work because it's too NATO. We cannot write things to NATO in Brazil. We have to think independently. And so you now have a small fraction of a picture of the way things are discussed there in Brazil, and the way we had to work with different views, different issues. And financing was the last one, is still going on, because we have proposed tax for the internet users. Whenever you buy a SIM card in Brazil, you have to pay for, it's the same here, for some giga for accessing internet. And then we had defined that we're going to pay 1.5% of that amount to use a safer internet. It took like 6 hours to become public and go down. Not because of the public, actually, because some congressmen, they look at the things the way they were and said, oh, this is from the government. I'm against the government, in a very American way. I'm against the government, so I don't agree. Well, but it's good for the public. If we have to pay, it's not good enough. So in this case, what should we do? I have decided to propose to the minister, and this time he listened to me, and he decided to go with a different strategy. How much does it cost if we don't do it? Okay, so no one wants to pay, but how much is gonna cost if we don't do anything the way we should do? We took a number from the Brazilian strategy in 2020. It was around 120 billion reais. It should be like 26 billion US dollars. And we brought it to present value. And then we said, okay, this is like 120, 85% of this is easy to control, easy to avoid if we educate the people, if we implement some basic measures. So we can implement we can avoid like 85%, but let's work with only 50%. So it's like 60 billion. And then due to the Brazilian taxation, it's like 24 billion in taxes. And the agency is gonna cost like $500 million. So I don't mind if the money comes from the people, from the budget, from whatever. Since we have $500 million to avoid losing 24 billion in taxation for the government. So we presented to Minister Haddad, from the economy minister, and he said, okay, I agree. Let's try to find the money. And this is the way we are trying to finance the agency right now. We don't know where the money comes from. Probably from avoiding evasion, tax evasions, but we are not sure. Where do we start right now? I'm not sure about the time we still have. Okay, so okay, I'm just finishing. That said, we have a proposal, a bill that is going to the Congress probably by the end of next month. So I suppose we're gonna beat the Colombians. They were going faster than us, but surprisingly, we are going a bit faster right now, and probably by the end of next month, we're going to propose the bill to the Congress to create the Brazilian National Cybersecurity Agency. Thank you for your patience, and I hope I made myself clear.
Thank you for that, Marcelo. Joe?
Thank you very much. And thank you also to Rusi and FIU for inviting me to participate in the event, but also for kind of using your mutual convening power to actually set up this event. And the two previous panels, I've really enjoyed it. I've learned a lot just from listening to everybody, as I'm sure everybody in the room has, and the people we can't see, but we know are joining us also online. I know there's sort of almost nothing that sounds worse than an academic saying, I will confine myself to a series of brief remarks, because to run for the hills. But I really will, not least because it really isn't possible for me, even if I wanted to sort of inject a contrarian element to this panel particularly, because I agree implicitly, with the main points that Luis and Marcelo have already said. I've previously had the privilege to collaborate with Luis, and I've written about the national policy that Marcelo was talking about, and I'd really commend that policy document to be read if you haven't read it already. It's a very interesting document that I think is an example of a lot of the things that have been talked about both now and in the previous two panels, both in what it says and in what it sort of artfully omits and writes around in terms of the interinstitutional or interagency discussions that happen along the way to creating a national cybersecurity policy. You know, maybe we'll talk about that in questions a little bit later. But I think, you know, where I'd like to start is to pick up something that was said in the previous panel, where someone said there are no demons in cyber capacity building. And by which I think they meant that you collaborate with different actors without prejudice, you know, given the context. And I think for the purposes of this discussion, I'd sort of slightly rephrase that and say there are no demons in cyber capacity building, but there are clearly demons in cybersecurity. You know, if there were no demons, then cybersecurity would be a far less wicked problem of public policy to solve. There'd be much less reason for states to pursue securitized approaches, you know, to the problems, you know, some of which, you know, appropriately securitized, some of which not. And I think we naturally gravitate, and I think we have naturally gravitated to discussing the internal challenges to creating a centralized national cyber strategy, but it's also worth dwelling on the fact that there are external challenges too, and the interplay between the internal and external largely drive the context in which governments are operating. So, you know, non-state actors, hostile states, states that foster permissive, safe harbor jurisdictions in which and from which cyber criminals can operate and essentially identify targets, you know, anywhere across the globe. You know, so although we're talking about how states develop national approaches to cybersecurity, you know, those national approaches are addressing genuinely transnational problems, which is why, you know, all of the panels this afternoon have focused on the importance of collaboration in cyber capacity building and cyber diplomacy, because no one country can solve all of these problems on its own. So, you know, there has to be partnership, there has to be working together. And that's actually one thing in the Brazilian national strategy document you see, it's very clearly informed by reflecting on other country cases. You know, not just sort of looking for best practice to bring into the country, but reflecting, as again, you know, has been said in previous panels, on how to adapt you know, specific things from different contexts so that it's appropriate to your national context. So I think that's a really good example of that approach in action. So I was tempted to sort of to talk about three challenges, to talk about politics, coordination, and capacity building, appropriately given the theme for the afternoon. But I sort of reflected that although that would be rhetorically very, very complete, actually everything comes down to politics. And I think politics is really an undercurrent to everything that all the panelists have spoken about this afternoon. So you have the politics of time. So, you know, how executives allocate their limited bandwidth. So it's appropriate for us as researchers and practitioners in cybersecurity to think that cybersecurity is everything, but obviously for executives, it's not. There are plenty of other non-cyber challenges that governments face. So cyber is always competing with other issues for the time, you know, the executive making those national strategic decisions. There's the politics of priorities then. So, you know, how the country implements a prioritized approach to dealing with its different national security challenges, of which cybersecurity and resilience is an important part, but not the only part. As Louise said, you know, how you allocate the money is very important. And you know, you can have the most beautiful blueprint in the abstract, but if you can't fund it, if you can't implement it, then it's, you know, it's going to be much less helpful than it otherwise would have been. And perhaps there are more incremental ways that would have been better to achieve progress faster than creating that beautiful abstract blueprint. And then the politics of communication, which again, I think is something that you see if you look at any country, and I'm going to use the journey word, but you know, the national journey towards an increasingly centralized or increasingly integrated approach to cyber strategy. There are different choices or different phases in the way that governments communicate about those strategies. And I think one of the things, you know, that's both, I guess, a challenge and an opportunity is about identifying the different audiences that you are speaking to, you know, whether it's through a draft policy document or a national strategy, or even just in the normal sort of ad hoc communication of ministers and senior officials in speeches they make, you know, engagements that they have. You know, what are you primarily talking to a domestic constituency or to a series of different domestic constituencies? And that can literally be, you are a government official from one institution and you are continuing the interagency, the intra-governmental conversation in the public, interventions that you make. But there are a number of other domestic constituencies as well. That can be sort of, private sector stakeholders, civil society. In a previous panel, they talked about, I think, a really important point, which is about improving that basic sort of cybersecurity education across the board. And so education has to be a significant component of national cyber strategy, even if it isn't sort of front and center in a specific capacity or institutionally oriented piece of draft legislation, because it's thinking about the whole picture holistically. So I think thinking about communication, about the fact that you have a multiplicity of different domestic stakeholders, but then bringing that international piece or transnational piece into it too, because you're also communicating with a range of other international actors. Now that can be states, it can be non-state international actors. It can be a conversation as part of an existing, multilateral process, of which there are several, but it might not be that. It could be a minilateral process, a regional process. It could be talking about the relationship between governments and international non-state actor stakeholders. So I think there are a lot of communication decisions that are integral, even if they're sort of second order decisions to the big strategic questions about what you prioritize and how you go about it. So I think the primacy of politics, the fact that everything is imbricated in politics, the politics of choosing. And also, I guess the thing that I would say is to kind of continue, I would say the sort of the note of persistent realism throughout the afternoon rather than pessimism is to say that you can't take progress for granted. So even the examples of success, in the region are not necessarily going to be sort of immutable. You have to work hard to sustain even the achievements that you've already achieved. You can't just bank them and assume that they will be there as the bedrock of your subsequent efforts. You've got to maintain what you've already achieved as well. And I think the politics of that, is incredibly important. That there's a wider non-cyber discussion around the world about the fragility of institutions of democracy or liberal democracy. And that's a very important part of this conversation as well. So I think I will pause there.
Fantastic. Thanks, Joe. So I am going to go to questions rather quickly. I'm going to ask one question here, and then those of you online, please feel free to type in your question. I have the iPad right here in front of me, and those in the audience, just give me kind of the 2-finger wave, and I'll call on you there. One of the things that really stood out, and Carolyn asked a question, and I remember Arthur's response vividly, if we can go back, have those resources that we have now. So I think about in the context of everyone mentioned the resource constraints, everyone talked about the problem. Joe, you talked about what I call the fire truck issue. You're choosing between, do you invest in technology or do you invest in a fire truck? And which is more valuable to the civil society that's asking you and demanding of services to you. And we talked about strategy development. And if you have those limited resources and you're competing resources, how do we get to that second phase, which Marcella brought up, which is the implementation side of the house? So thinking of that divide between the strategy development and the implementation side, and Marcella, I'll start with you. What are those considerations that Brazil is doing, but also Latin American countries as a whole and the countries that you've dealt with over your career? What are those conversations like?
Well, really good question. The problem in Brazil is thinking about things 10 years ago is quite hard because there was political turmoil all over the country. So it was very hard to advance anything. Then things changed, but not that much. And they are changing again. So the Brazilian society is now prepared for dealing with some serious circumstances like cybercrime grows like 28 to 30% all over the world, on average. And in Brazil, it's like 38 to 39%. So it is always growing more in Brazil than in the rest of the world. So the Brazilians look at the numbers and say, we need to do something. This is a very good point, good start. And then what to do? Well, we have some informed decisions we can take regarding personal capabilities. We need to develop national capabilities. Brazilians are very creative. We have a pretty good software industry. So since software is the mainstream of cyber threats, we can develop Brazilian tools, Brazilian culture, Brazilian everything related to software. But still, we have a very materialistic society, and they think about chips and silicon stuff and computers and hardware and so on. So we have been dealing with this circumstance in Brazil, this situation in Brazil, and fortunately, I have been able to convince many decision makers that software is more Brazilian-like, and then we can work a bit harder, joking with the words, a bit harder on software than in hardware. And that said, we have been deciding, have been discussing where to invest before, the first things to do. And capacitation is one, and in this case, NATO friends have been pretty useful, pretty friendly, offering like 4. Lina was there training Brazilian government officials. And we have been dealing with capacitation, and this is going fine. Although in the final review of the Brazilian bill we have proposed, they took out the education part because we have a Ministry of Education. So they have to deal with, not the agency. But they left at least the culture preparation, cultural education, let's say, because they understand we need to work with exercise. For instance, we have a huge exercise in Brazil, national one. We call it Cyber Guardian. And actually, it was the way I have arrived to the government, working with the military in this national exercise for 4 years. We have the 5th edition going on October. It's very nice. Like 750 guys working with problems. I am the guy who invents the problems. I'm good at creating problems, better than in solving them. And then I create the problems, and the guys there exercise their capabilities, their abilities to solve them. And then we have decided that this is important. We need to keep it up and put it all together in the agency. And also we are focusing in National SOC, Security Operations Center. And this is brand new because Brazilian agencies, regulator agencies in Brazil are not allowed to operate anything. They regulate and they observe the complement of that law. And then we are able to create a regulation agency that is able to have some operational capability. It's something new in the Brazilian culture, in the Brazilian institutions. So we have been trying to advance something in the institutional framework we have, and we have been able to create something different for the Brazilian needs. And we are talking about like 800 guys working there. It's a small number considering European numbers, American numbers, forget it. And then, but it's fine. It's not what we need, but it's what we are able to get in a very Bismarckian way. Politics as the way, the art of the possible, the attainable, and we are doing what is possible, attainable in the Brazilian politics right now.
Thank you, Marcelo. And again, if you have questions, please give me the 2-finger wave and then I'll turn it over. But Luis, you've been a part of a lot of these conversations, right? This debate between strategy and implementation of said strategy, but also who's responsible for executing said strategy. So what are those conversations like and what have you seen?
No, absolutely. And I think I'll classify, and I really want to try to keep it short because I want to hear from the audience as well, for us to have a conversation. But I would separate, let's say this into 3 bits and pieces. I think there are existing cooperation channels. I mean, with Latin American countries on the area of cyber, that has been increasingly relevant. I mean, so like North-South and South-South that we were talking about previously. In terms of North-South, I mean, the UK and Brazil have signed an MOU focusing on cyber. It was last year, if my mind serves me well, a little bit earlier than that, if I'm not mistaken. You know, but we also have South-South kind of like increasing like cooperation. So Colombia and Chile signed an MOU back in 2019. So you imagine, like, even before the pandemic, even before, let's say, all of these ransomware incidents, right, to kind of also kind of try to strengthen those channels. So I think that it's important to recognize that those things have been in place. And for some time, I think it's about strategically understanding how to activate them and to explore those MOUs and other, let's say, kind of like cooperation mechanisms. I think there are also thematically specific types of cooperation that we've been seeing for the past couple of years. One example from the Brazilian side of things, you know, so Brazil has, and other colleagues as well, have participated in the Locked Shields exercise. So folks from the Ministry of Defense, you know, the Cybercom over in Brazil have been able to engage in that level. And there's also like exercises at the regional level that try to like also promote that POC network, which then goes back to my point on like how we have sometimes different conversations happening at different levels, right? So at that level, you see, let's say, for example, Locked Shields or the Cyber Guardian in Brazil, or the regional kind of exercise trying to, you know, help, you know, people that are working in this area to locate the POCs and their respective, let's say, not MFAs, but MODs. But when you go to the OES, there's the CBMs, the cyber, the confidence building measures working group that has been there, I think, since 2016. And in that particular CBM's working group, you do see that there is one of the norms that they have agreed, or the confidence building measures that they have agreed. This is me talking norms. The CBMs that they have agreed to is to have a POC from each of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is already kind of like another measure that adds to that layer. So it's not as if, you know, we're starting from scratch, but what I would definitely highlight is some of the success factors in putting the right pins in place. So right now, I think we're at the stage where we do have all these different initiatives, but the National Cybersecurity Agency and the bills that are being discussed are really the fundamental pinpoints for implementation, right? So we can talk about very ad hoc implementation, but when we talk about these national strategies, I think we're talking about, you know, going to where we would like to have been for a couple of years. So in Brazil, for example, you do have it foresees, the bill foresees the National Cybersecurity Agency, a cabinet for managing cyber crises, which is very important. I mean, when you think about coordination internationally as well, and you could definitely elaborate on that if you'd like. We do have a committee, a multi-stakeholder committee that would be put in place as part of that bill. So that is very similar to the Chilean proposal, right? So one of the key elements of the Chilean proposal, in addition to establishing the National Cybersecurity Agency, is having a multi-stakeholder body to kind of like promote that coordination and input. And finally, there's also another point to the Chilean proposal, which is also establishing principles, and something that the Brazilian one also does. And one thing that we didn't mention, which is going back to the offensive cyber bit, is that there is a principle in the Chilean bill, which I think should be kind of like a reflection for other countries in Latin America, which is talking about the principle of responsibility and responding. And that is something very unique to, let's say, that proposal, which I've seen, like I haven't seen it in other proposals, but that is something about making sure that every response that the country is conducting is never going to be necessarily an offensive action. So responsibility, then, you know, conducting offensive operations wouldn't necessarily be within the remit of thinking about being responsible. Anyhow, just like a particular element, just to talk about the success factors and how we think about which pins are being put in place for looking at implementation in the long run.
Absolutely. And Joe, you talked a lot about those, you framed it under political challenge. I think that's how you did it. And thinking about that implementation side of the house, right? What are you seeing from your perch in terms of efforts to implement? And Luis created a interesting picture because we have a web on top of web on top of web.
Hopefully it makes sense.
and within each country, you have even more webs that are built in. How do you detangle that web, if you will, to be able to move legislation forward and move activities in terms of building internal resiliency forward?
Yeah,
There, that's a great question, and I'll try and sort of build on the two previous responses, but quickly. And at the risk of mixing the metaphors where you're talking about the webs upon webs. I mean, what I was thinking was it's not that it almost doesn't matter what the sort of the institutional design is, because definitely some institutional designs are better than others on paper. But I think even something that looks good on paper will succeed or fail depending on the life that is breathed into it by the executive. So and that could be true, or that could be true or not true at different phases of its development. So it could start off well, and then it could shrivel and die because it just isn't loved enough. You know, it isn't used in the way that it was meant to be used. So I think the question there is about the persistence of political commitment. You know, at the beginning to set something up like the new Brazilian proposal, but then to follow it through and to make it an established part of the furniture, or more than part of the furniture, you know, a loved and used part of the furniture that is useful. So I think, yeah, again, the sort of the primacy of political commitment and sustained sort of persistent political engagement is important. On the confidence building measures that, you know, we've mentioned already and have been mentioned in previous sessions, I think they are very important. And you could say that they're important in a way that they don't tend to be used, or the language doesn't tend to be used, which is domestically. So between different institutional actors. So say there is a point of tension, you know, between, say, you know, the armed forces and the non-military actors in cyber strategy, it's important to diffuse that. You know, it's important to get beyond it, particularly if, you know, in a given, you know, country case, and we've talked about Brazil, so let's talk about Brazil. You know, the armed forces are a significant, capable cyber actor. So they should be part of that national conversation. And there are a number of different facets of their role that should be discussed, you know, in that context, but also regionally. So one thing that, you know, occurred to me was, you know, just as you have exchanges in professional military education, so around the region, you know, people from one country going to, you know, to schools, you know, in other countries, there's no reason why that couldn't be done for cybersecurity over time. You know, the more instances of, you know, having cyber strategy or cybersecurity, cyber defense, you know, master's programs or development programs, those should be collaborative and cooperative, and you know, different countries should send delegates, and that's a further way of building confidence and trust, you know, within the region.
Absolutely, and great points. I think we had a question over here, so we'll go 1, 2. If you could please identify yourself and then keep the question a question, as how often happens. So, sir. Yes, please. So we will grab you.
So
a mic.
yes, we need to get that mic.
We'll grab it for you right now.
Oh, great. We have a better one.
Yes. Yes, sir.
Oh, I think
There we
there's
go.
something on. We can just go without one. It's, yeah.
I will share with Martha.
There we go. Thank you very much. Hopefully that was worth the build up. So my name's James Norman. I work in the Cabinet Office just across the road in our National Cyber Strategy team. I was reflecting on this really interesting discussion how we had quite a few points around the legitimacy of national cybersecurity centres, and also some of the questions around funding, which are clearly stuff that we faced as well in the UK. And I'd be interested in views on how the UK's solution to some of these problems around having things like our National Cyber Advisory Board, which is a group of industry and academic experts to advise government to hold us to account on our national cyber strategy, and also our partnership with industry could potentially work in a Latin American context, or perhaps focusing particularly on Brazil, whether that's something that can work in the same way and what that might look like in order to achieve success.
Fantastic. And if we could take the second question as well.
Hi, everyone. I am Francisco Vera. My question has to do more. Yeah, they're better. My question is related to the difference of a scale within the region. So whereas starting a new agency in Brazil might involve serious challenges in resources and everything because it's orders of magnitude bigger than other countries. In Uruguay, you just have an agency for digital governance and just put cybersecurity in the remit, and that's it. So how to deal and navigate that, especially considering that among the biggest countries in Latin America. Three of them at least have like federal governments, like Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and how that also changes the landscape of the conversation and also the distribution of the responsibilities within the states. Because sometimes the high-level design can look in one way, but then that in part of the implementation of the size of the challenges or the governance can change very radically because of these like not so small units. I mean, some states in Brazil can equal to a country in the rest of South America. So yeah.
Fantastic. Do we have any more questions on this side? Yes, and one more over here. We'll take that third question, then we'll go to a panel starting with Joe.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Augusto Teixeira, visiting scholar at King's. I have a question for Mr. Malaguti. Congratulations on your speech. My question is regarding to the issue that when you look at Brazil case, there's a country which makes itself notable by not having necessarily a strong security sector or official one. In that sense, do you see the cyber development in terms of institutional capability a part of construction or building of a national security sector bottom up, in terms that you have first layers of well-structured policy and strategy, military base and defense base, and now you have like a civilian awareness about the relevance of this issue. In that sense, do you see like the burning of a security sector from below, in which the military still has an important part in role in it, in sense of creating in the future a security sector that today doesn't exist properly? Thank you.
Thank you. So Joe, feel free to answer 1, 2, all, or just ignore me and just answer whatever you want. So Joe.
No, thank you. So I think what I'll do is try to answer the first two questions pretty much in tandem by saying that I think the UK example is interesting and useful. It has traveled already. I think in one of the previous sessions, I think the very first session, the UK cyber network in the region was mentioned as a good thing. And from what I can see, it has been a good thing to establish sort of a more effectively regularized relationship between the UK government and governments in the region on sort of cyber capacity building. But I think, again, mentioning that the Brazilian draft policy, that clearly was informed by examples from Europe, including I think the UK example. So I think the example has traveled, and I think it's right that it has, because I think even though the country context is different, I think a lot of the challenges are similar, even though the modalities of the way that they're experienced that differ according to context, as pretty much everyone has very sensibly said this afternoon. So that there are political challenges, there are interinstitutional challenges, even if the congressional context for cyber strategy in Brazil is different from the parliamentary context of cyber strategy in the UK. I think quite different. But I think thinking about the different models for cooperation and how you might do it, depending on where you start from, depending where the expertise is in the national system, I think those are those are things that actually do travel and can be adapted to national context. I'm trying to think about how I was going to segue into the second question, and I've sort of lost what I was going to say. So actually that's probably good for time, and if I remember, I'll maybe get a chance to come back.
Don't worry, I have the question written down. We'll make sure to hit you later. Louise.
Hey, yeah, thanks for the questions. I think on the UK's experience and how it translates, or what are the possible avenues, as well as thinking, would it be useful? I agree completely with what Joe said. I think there's a strong, I can say for the Brazilian kind of side of things, that there's a strong cooperation with Brazil for many, many years. The digital access program in Brazil is a huge, also capacity building element in terms of thinking about different schools, thinking about more of the educational side. But I think to your point on, let's say, the advisory board, I think there's some elements, and I don't know how much we can correlate with these other, let's say, international experiences, the UK and others, right? But the Brazilian bill and the Chilean bill do include a multi-stakeholder advisory board that would kind of, look at, and I think the Brazilian proposal actually has a more, more concrete language around this, that it's actually like if there's a policy and there's like a national policy on cybersecurity that needs to be approved after this one or something of the center plan, it needs to go through that multi-stakeholder body, right? So I think it's interesting to see how these models have been fitting in. So I'd say that definitely there's something there. And in the partnership with industry, I'd say we still need to walk a couple of miles. I can say again, from the Brazilian perspective, in terms of reaching out to different associations of, let's say, software industry that I know that is very strong in Brazil. But maybe we still need to take a couple of steps on fostering that on the cyber side. I think there's a lot of innovation and e-governments. There's an easy language there, but on cyber, maybe we need to advance in terms of mutual kind of like collaboration. But on your point, Francisco, on how to deal with scale, I understand where you're coming from. Uruguay is a very unique and interesting case because they have 90% of the population connected, and having the information security as part of their national, let's say, agency for government, e-government is quite unique. But in Brazil, I'd say, and maybe if we did have a German in the room, it would be nice to hear from a German in the room on like the federated aspect. But I think one of the challenges of the bill going forward and thinking about this model of centralized governance is how to reach the local levels. We had lots, as in the US as well, we had lots of different states being hit by ransomware attacks focused on local or state courts. And that is a kind of loss that we really can't quantify, honestly, but you do have a very localized impact. So I think I don't have a complete answer to your question. I just think it's something that we'll need to deal very concretely. I mean, the size of Brazil and the amount of states that we have, and the disparities between the southeast of Brazil, which is Rio, Sao Paulo, and all of that, where you have more connectivity, and the other parts, which will be much more susceptible to, let's say, other types of cybercrime, is a reality that's not going to go away. And I think, the National Cybersecurity Agency, when you have a centralized model in a very big country, I think that's a particular challenge, and it's not necessarily a CISA kind of like setup. So let's see how it's going to go.
Yeah, and if I could,
for you to resolve.
yeah, absolutely. If I could use moderator's privilege on that specifically, again, the early part of my career was focused on Central America, working specifically in Northern Triangle. It's a paradox because you have these vulnerabilities because of the limited resources and the limited capabilities that you've had. Again, that's changing, but you have an opportunity as well, and that opportunity is the ability to quickly readapt towards new conditions and respond accordingly. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worst, right? If it leans more authoritarian as compared to democratic processes, but in general, if you can lean more in towards the opportunistic angle of being a smaller state, think Estonia or others, right? You can do a lot of good for your community at large. So Marcelo, you did get a question directly, but you're welcome to answer any of the three questions.
Well, thank you all three for your questions. First, regarding the UK as a model, well, you have been a model to us in Brazil because your more European culture is closer to the Brazilian way of seeing the world than the American one. However, active cyber defense is something we cannot even speak about in Brazil. When I wrote in the bill, the proposal, coordinated response, they told me, let's take it out because the response is not necessary. I'm sorry, what do you mean? We're not going to respond, we just need to defend. Okay, so this is the general idea in the Brazilian culture. Despite the British strategy has been used as in many parts as an example of construction, of consolidating ideas. This is the threat, this is the way we intend to respond. And you could make our job a bit easier if you, with the Mandarin, French and Arabic version, you could even write one in Portuguese. It would be easier for us to work with. Think about it next year, maybe, because you clearly use the British strategy as a way of saying things, and why not? Why not saying things? The things you say are important, the things you don't say are equally important. And when you put your strategy in different languages, you are sending a very clear message. And we got it in Brazil. Probably not the same way you intended to, but we got it. Well, the second question is, well, we have to find a model for you to compare. If you think about what we did in Brazil, we took the French and the British as the models in terms of numbers. We consider our economy in terms of purchase power parity, similar, a bit larger than the British and the French one. And then we said, well, the French have 3,600 guys working in their agency. So we need something similar, but we're not gonna have it. So what can we get to solve our problem? What we need to solve at the bare basics of our problem, 800, this is our number. So you need to think about it and to compare, find a formula to compare it. And I'm sure you're gonna find something interesting for you and something you can use with your parliament, with your government to work for. And regarding the bottom-up view in Brazil, I guess, no, we don't. We don't have it. We have a kind of patchwork in Brazil. We have a Micronesia of islands of expertise in Brazil. And we have a lack of coordination in Brazil. We need to put it all together. And this is what we are trying to do right now. But it's not something bottom-up. It is centralized. It is a central view. I'm a centralizer, and naturally, I think we need to coordinate things from the top. And this is the predominant view right now. It's the main view, mostly because of me. And this is the way I used to write things, and they are following my advice and writing it this way. However, considering the Brazilian islands of expertise. For instance, we heard today that here in the UK, ransomware is a national cybersecurity threat, national threat. In Brazil, I used to think the same way, but I cannot write it because ransomware is crime, and crime is a federal police issue. So I'm not going to be able to write that ransomware is something that the Brazilian agency has to deal with because it's a crime, and crime they have to deal with. So considering everything, the situation there is we are trying to coordinate things, but we have to respect some particular views. And however, the military are not a problem. Actually, they were the easier group to talk with because they understand they have only a small bunch of guys working there, very good guys, but a small bunch, and they are losing a lot of people to the private market. So the only problem they saw in the proposal we did was, you're not going to take our people. Okay, you can do whatever you want, but leave my people there. So this was the only situation we had, the sensitive situation we had to deal with the military. So this is, I guess it's not.
Well, I always like ending on a positive note, so thank you for that. And Marcelo, Luis, Joe, I appreciate your insights and your expertise on this issue. Please join me in giving them a round of applause for their time. I will now ask that Dr. Carlos Solar please join us up front for some closing remarks. And Marcelo, Joe, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you once again. Appreciate it. Luis?
No, absolutely. I don't want to keep you, as again, Randy said, I don't want to keep you from any other engagements that you might have, but it has been a pleasure to be able to kick off our events over here at RUSI back at, a historical building. This is one of the very first events, and to be able to do that talking about Latin America and talking about cyber is an internal kind of effort that, the cyber program together with international security and having a great partner such as FIU that we've been discussing this for quite some time. So to see this coming to fruition is a real pleasure and definitely not the last. So please stay tuned. The whole point of, it's just a really brief remarks. I would love to hear from my colleagues, collaborators and co-organizers, what is the key takeaway from this conversation? Definitely, we will be producing a report out of this. So please stay in touch if you have any other contributions that you didn't, and also online that you didn't manage to put through and that you would like us to hear, please feel free to do so. But I just wanted to turn over to you, Carlos, and maybe kind of pass over and ask you, if you had to have like one takeaway from our conversation today, what would it be?
I think all panelists did great in marrying politics and policy, as Joe was mentioning. I think our next mission will be to illuminate the map with further research. I think there are many countries that we didn't touch upon, just because mostly we use Brazil as an example of how to do things, given its federative ways of doing policy, starting pretty early in 2008 with a cyber defense kind of like similar strategy for the rest of Latin America. But I think it was very powerful to see how multilateral organizations and then country-based initiatives are leading the path in Latin America. I still think that there's a quote of realism that everyone touched upon. I think that was the main takeaway of probably panel one, in which although there is cooperation, there's always confrontation and so on. And I think we missed some countries, right? So we didn't talk about India, we didn't talk about Turkey, maybe we didn't talk about Australia and their role in Latin America. So I think we left some gaps probably for next year, and when we will invite you as well to come and join us. So I think that'll be it, and I know everyone probably wants to go.
Well, I'll be brief. And again, I want to thank Rusi again, James, and trusting us with this partnership. And of course, my dear friends, Luis and Carlos, for putting this together. It was a vision over a pub back in March, and we turned it into reality now here in September. So thanks so much for the partnership, the friendship, as always. If I have to leave, and it's kind of a cop-out because Lena said it earlier, transformation is human. The transformation is human, and the fact that we have so many people in the room and so many people that joined us online speaks to the reality that we care, that it's important, that this matters. And coming from when we were at LASA in Boston, and you alluded to it earlier, 4 people in the room to this today, it shows that this truly matters. And the way, and I challenge you all, is to not just continue the conversation, but rather transition that conversation into action. And to those that are already doing it, obviously Spanish, I love the Canadians and what the Canadians are doing and Arthur's leadership in that effort. And of course, all the other partners across the globe. I challenge you to move towards action and also take lessons learned from the region, because there's a lot of great things that are occurring in the region that can be used across the globe. So Rusi, thank you again. And thank you all those for joining us in the room. Appreciate it.
Yes, and I have the opportunity to be the final one to speak, but I'll be very brief. I promise I'll be brief. I think there are 3 key points that I would take away from our discussion, maybe a provocation. I think there's one element of recognizing the diversity of countries and levels of maturity across the region. And I think it goes back to your point, Carlos, that we need to do better in actually getting to those realities. Our Responsible Cyber Behavior Project really tries to kind of go towards that, to map, countries across different regions and how they see responsibility in practice. So hopefully that's a way of going beyond. But I do think that, Caribbean countries, we need to talk more about them. And of course, There are also other interesting players in the region. We didn't talk about Venezuela as well. We didn't talk about, attribution in those contexts. So there's a lot of like interesting things that we can unpack. The second provocation, or let's say future, work that we can think about is looking at crisis response. I know Lena has touched upon that, but I think there are models for thinking crisis response in the region and what are the pins that need to be in place for that to happen in a more agile way internationally and across different countries in the region. And finally, I think we heard guys a lot. So, we had a lot of guys in this agency or that agency, and that's fine. But I think we need to take the tip from the Canadians and actually think a little bit more about that gender balance across all of these discussions, right? So I think these are my 3K takeaways. And as the person leading the conversation, I would just go back to like the 3 points. Just wanted to thank you all so much for sticking around. Let's stay in touch. Please reach out to Randy, Brian, James, myself, Carlos. We're here and we're happy to continue the conversation. So hopefully this is not the last of our conversation. So thanks a lot. Have a lovely end of the day.